Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Maddie Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kenner suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And you can find out more about me at MaddieDalrymple.com and at theindieauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask writers two questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn from their book that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And I am here today with Travis Jeppesen. Hey, Travis, how are you doing?
Hi, how's it going?
It's going great. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Travis Jeppesen is the author of 10 books, including The Suiciders, Victims, and See You Again in Pyongyang. He has contributed articles to the New York Times Magazine, Artforum, Moose, Wall Street Journal, The Believer, and the Review of Contemporary Fiction. An accomplished art critic, he's the recipient of the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. His calligraphic and text-based artwork has been the subject of solo exhibitions at Wilkinson Gallery in London, Exile in Berlin, and Rupert in Vilnius. And he has been featured in group exhibitions internationally, and his latest book is Settlers Landing. And so today I'm asking Travis the two What I Learned questions about Settlers Landing, starting with, what did you learn that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Um, it might sound super obvious, but I think one of the things that I learned in writing this book, or something that I knew before, but writing this really solidified this piece of advice, would be to follow your instinct. Intuition is really everything, and it's deeply connected to voice, I think. Once you find the voice of your character, whoever's voice you might happen to be writing in, or if you're writing the book in third person, the perspective that you're writing from, once you kind of discover that voice, that really impels the narrative forward, I think. And this is kind of intimately tied to you know, there's this piece of hackneyed MFA advice that you kind of hear all the time that writers always hear, which is, write what you know. And I've always been really against that piece of advice. Actually, I always sort of tell my students, don't write what you know. In fact, try to write what you don't know. And in doing so, you might actually learn something. When once you go on that path of discovery, you might actually learn something, and I think the reader will go along with you on that journey. Writing this book, most of the main characters in this book, which is a satire, most of the main characters are billionaires. And believe it or not, I myself am not a billionaire. So this
Mhm.
is like a world that I didn't know at all. So yeah, it requires you to do a lot of research, but that's part of the journey as well. So, yeah, so I guess those are the kind of the two things that I learned, which are somewhat contradictory, I guess, because, it's about like following your voice, following your intuition, but at the same time, allowing yourself to sort of like go into strange territory when need be and doing all the research that's necessary to back that up. So I hope that makes sense and it's not too
Yeah,
contradictory.
yeah, it
So,
totally makes sense. I'm wondering if there are any sort of red flags that you think writers can watch out for that would indicate that they're sticking too closely to write what you know, and that might be a signal that they should be trying to venture further into things that are further from their own experience.
yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of fiction one is setting out to write. If you're setting out to write something that's markedly autobiographical, then it's okay. Um, to date, I haven't really written any autobiographical fiction, and so I'm really interested in sort of exploring the unknown. I think that there's a close connection between the writing of fiction and acting a little bit, where you're playing a role a little bit. You're playing someone else. So I guess if you're doing things that, if I'm find myself too veering too closely towards the personal, then I guess I try to go strange, try to maybe throw yourself off. I think a really good thing to do is to give yourself constraints, make little rules for when you're setting out to write your book. For example, one of the rules that I set myself in writing Settlers Landing was that I wanted to write a book with mostly unlikable characters. This is like a satire. And so I'm really portraying like aspects of the world that I dislike a great deal. And I'm trying to deal with those aspects of life in the world with humor and through like sort of exaggeratedly depicting certain human traits that I find despicable. So yeah, so that's kind of that's an example of one of the constraints or one of the rules that I made for myself when writing this book.
Did you find that you were complying with the saying that even the villain is the hero of their own story? And do you tap into those areas where the despicable billionaires are more like you or less like you when you're
Mhm.
creating them?
Um, Hopefully less like me, but there's I guess this is where we get into where anytime a writer sits down to write, of course that there are going to be aspects of themselves projected into their characters. Yeah, certainly there's there's like a black humor that the characters share that I also share. That's part of the general world or the general, as the kids of today like to say, vibe of the book. And so, yeah, so there's certainly that connection there, I would say.
And I'm going to switch over to what did you learn that you'd like to share with your fellow readers? And I'm going to start out by asking, what have readers' reactions been to your portrayal of these despicable billionaires?
Mhm. Yeah, I think most people, I think first of all, I mean, the book doesn't come out until tomorrow, and so,
Yeah, congratulations.
oh,
Good
thank
timing.
you. Yeah, yeah, good timing. Yeah, so not too many reactions so far, but most of my friends are those closest to me who have gotten to read like advanced the book. They're more just kind of they're a little bit intimidated by the length. It's a rather
It
lengthy
is
book.
hefty. It's a hefty
Uh,
book.
836, 822 pages. Yeah.
I have to ask,
Um,
how many words did that end up being?
just under 300,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I didn't set out to kind of write such a long book. My earlier books are all pretty thin, but this one, it's just kind of, sort of like discussing what I was doing before, I was just like following my instinct, my intuition. If you have one really good idea, then oftentimes like lots of other ideas and lots of subplots veer off from that one good idea. And so I really just kind of let that process evolve organically and, many different plots, kind of subplots kind of branched off of the main plot in writing this one. And so it was very organic, albeit it took a lot of time to write, but yeah.
Yeah. So how did
So
you make the decision about when you had an idea that came to you while you were working on Settlers Landing?
mhm.
Did you intentionally make a decision about whether it was going to be a plot thread that was going to be included in that book as opposed to the basis of a different book?
Mhm. No, it was all I was very, very certain what fit into this book and what was directly connected to the narrative or to different sort of subplots that characters were involved with. So yeah, I mean, I did edit quite a bit out because in sort of following my instinct and following my gut, I wrote quite a few pages, several chapters. There were a couple of subplots that just in the end I ended up cutting from the book because it didn't make sense. It didn't end up fitting in. But but I think it's important to make that decision after the fact, after it's already been written. You have to give it a chance because you never know. Maybe it will develop into something that's worth developing. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of advice to readers, as you were asking me earlier, I think the best advice I could give is just to be very ambitious in your reading, go outside your comfort zone. Forget about, one of the trends that you hear these days that I really can't stand at all is this issue of relatability, I liked this book because I felt I could relate to the characters, or I didn't like this book because I couldn't relate to any of the characters. This is something that's really foreign to my experience as a reader. I've never gone to read a novel in search of characters I could relate to. When I go to read, I want to have an encounter with otherness. I want to experience something that I've never experienced before. And so I think it's really a fundamental misconception of the function of art and literature when we start going to it seeking relatability, because that approach to reading, it really completely diminishes the imaginative function of fiction. What happened to like imagination? What happened to an embrace of like strangeness and otherness? So that's something that I find very worrying. And yeah, and I guess the final advice I could give is I'm not just saying this either because I wrote like an 800-page book, but the advice would be to like read long. Don't be afraid of reading really, really long books and pushing yourself through to the very end, even if you have to go through some passages that are, again, outside of your comfort zone, challenging, difficult. The books that have stayed with me the longest and that I really can remember are actually like the long reads, that I've submitted myself to, Dostoevsky's books, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. I remember my first year living in Germany, reading that book on the subway of Berlin and looking around me and trying to relate this book of Europe in the early 20th century, trying to relate the occurrences in that book to what I was seeing in the Europe of the early 21st century that I was living in. And so, yeah, that would be my advice for readers, I guess.
I love that advice for readers, and I encourage people to start acting on your advice with Settlers Landing. So, Travis, thank you so much for talking with me, and please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and Settlers Landing and all you do online.
Thank you. Yeah, you can visit www.itnapress.com. It's ITNA Press, where you can order copies of Settlers Landing, as well as copies of my first novel, Victims. And you can also check out my Substack, travisjeppesen.substack.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.